Wow, what an amazing selection of music. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Fatima. And thank you to Professor Lara Sheehy for the selection of music. My name is Garth Stevens. I am the president of the Psychological Society of South Africa, and it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome all of you from South Africa, from across the globe. It's again superb to have an international audience, despite our time differences and our geographies, and really wonderful to see so many of you joining. We're expecting more people to join us during the course of the evening, and so looking forward to a wonderful engagement. A special welcome also to Professor Lara Sheehy, who I'll introduce in a little while after I've done a little bit of an introduction about the webinar series and about Cisa and so forth. So this, of course, is the third webinar in the series on troubling psychology in troubled times. And really the series was introduced to continue some of the conversations that we would otherwise have had at the Cisa Annual Congress. But of course, we've not been able to have the Cisa Annual Congress for last year and this year. And it really provides a platform to extend many of the engagements that we would have had well beyond the disciplinary, the geographical, and the other boundaries that become defined by the way in which in-person conferences tend to be organized. So in lieu of the Cisa Congress, we are hosting a number of events this year in different formats for catering for diverse needs and of course multiple audiences and publics. And these include the Cisa workshop series, where there have been several workshops planned for the year, and I encourage you all to go off and have a look at the Cisa website, because of course these will continue till the end of 2021. There's also of course the Cisa webinar series hosted by the Cisa presidency, and in this particular year the theme is troubling psychology in troubled times, really trying to amplify and to contribute to one of the foci at the cutting edge of psychology at this particular moment. There are 4 webinars this year with some partners, some being hosted purely by Cisa. And of course, we have one more coming up towards the end of the year. I think it's in November sometime. And these are free and open to all. They are CPD accredited. There are 2 general CPD points accredited and attributed to all of these webinars. So please do fill out the requisite forms. We will conclude this year with the Cisa Annual President's Lecture, and the webinar series really gets tied off and tied together with this particular flagship Cisa event. And the Cisa Annual President's Lecture is really in memory of past Cisa presidents who've passed on, in recognition and to honor their contributions to society, to our society, to the discipline and profession. And yeah, I'm thinking about former colleagues like Sapir Nglobe, Patrick Sibaya, Rachel Prinsloo, and of course, most recently, Lionel Nicholas. The information from the office, just some housekeeping. We ask all delegates to complete the CPD evaluation form that will be shared in the chat in the last 15 or 20 minutes of the session in order to receive your CPD certificates for the 2 general CEU points. Information on the webinar and, series and workshop series will be shared during the webinar as well. But again, please do go off and have a look at the website. The webinar recording will also be made available on the Cisa YouTube channel in due course, so please do look out for that. I would also like to remind all of you as Cisa members that there are divisional and organizational AGMs coming up in the next several weeks. So again, please do look out for them and please do participate. Returning to tonight's talk, again, wonderful to have Professor Lara Sheehy here. Lara, I'm going to ask you to perhaps turn on your camera at this point, and just to welcome you. I'm going to introduce Lara very briefly. Lara is going to be speaking tonight on Psychoanalytic Innocence, the Ideological Underpinnings of Theory and Praxis. And rather than go into the abstract, which many of you would have read already, let me just introduce Lara directly as a colleague, a comrade, and a new friend. I've had the pleasure of working with Lara in the last while, and just great to have you here, Lara. Lara Sheehy is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the George Washington University Professional Psychology Program. She works on decolonial struggles, as well as power, race, class, and gender constructs and dynamics within psychoanalysis. Lara is the Secretary and President-elect of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology, and is also Chair of the Teachers Academy of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She's the co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality and Counterspace in Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, as well as on the editorial board for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Lara is on the advisory board to the USA Palestine Mental Health Network and Psychoanalysis for Pride. Lara is also co-author with Stephen Shee of the forthcoming book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practice, Resistance in Palestine. And that's a book that's been published by Routledge, and I think has come out already, or is shortly to come out, but it is a 2021 book. So really encouraging you all to go out there and just have a good look at the book and to purchase the book if necessary. Lara, I'm going to now call on you to really spend the next 35-40 minutes delivering your talk for us. We're really looking forward to it. If I can just request that delegates perhaps use the Q&A box. Please post your thoughts, please post your questions, please post your comments, and we'll have an opportunity after Lara's given her talk to engage and to have a conversation about this for 30 minutes or so. So Lara, I'm going to hand over to you, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Garth. I'm so excited to be here. مرحبا، اسمي لارا الشيحة. أهلا وسهلا بالكل، خصوصا اللي عم يتابعونا من البلاد العربية.
Lara, we've just lost you for a moment.
I think it just muted by itself for some reason. All right.
There you go.
Let's go back. So my name is Lara Shihai. I'm so excited to be here this evening. Really honored to be here today. Honestly, my partner, Stephen Shiha, and myself visited South Africa in March 2019. And as I always tell our comrades, we both left a piece of our heart there. So it's especially wonderful to be with you on this incredible webinar series. And those of you who haven't had the chance to watch, the videos are fantastic. And I'm really hopeful about the generative conversation we'll be having together here today. Just a special thank you, of course, the Psychological Society of South Africa, and my esteemed colleagues and comrade Garth, Mohammed Sidat, Shahnaz Safla, and everyone else who made today happen, including the sometimes invisible labor that really makes things run. So thank you, Fatima and Val and Mohammed especially. So without further ado, I'm gonna get started. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon, in his characteristically unbending clarity, states, and I'm quoting here, "In this work, I've made it a point to convey the misery of the Black man, physically and affectively. I have not wished to be objective. Besides, that would be dishonest. It's not possible for me to be objective," end quote. And I'd like to hold that in mind as I give my talk today. I'm speaking from the stolen land of the Massachusetts people. This acknowledgement, far from being enough to counter the ongoing wrecking effects of settler colonialism, is, for our purposes today, understood as a small and necessary act of reclaiming disavowed truths, as well as attending to the textured violence of racial history in this settler colony, what is now known as the United States. Truths and history that through innocence, especially as articulated by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, conveniently become displaced and disappeared. This disappearance, a disavowal in psychoanalytic terms, maintains a particular social order while hiding the mechanisms by which that order is maintained. The act of reclaiming disavowed truths and unabashedly naming them as such is the method by which I heed Fanon's call and attempt to counter in real time the perniciousness of what I have come to understand as psychoanalytic innocence. Objectivity, as it is encoded into psychoanalysis, of which neutrality is a subset, is one such valve of innocence. something that Fanon, working to shift psychoanalysis to include a sustained engagement with sociogeny, was speaking to as early as his dissertation, which then later became Black Skin, White Masks, which ironically, and perhaps not so, was rejected for being too subjective. In insisting on recalling disavowed truths, I will also borrow from Sarah Ahmad and quote, become a lodge, end quote. That is, in talking about psychoanalytic innocence, I'm committing myself, and therefore us, to the ethical imperative of disrupting settler colonial logic and racism by lodging a complaint about psychoanalysis' sordid history of claiming innocence, even as it actively perpetuates harm, and especially when it's confronted with the harm it is enacting. Following Ahmad's lead, I locate my complaint as an imperative that must include, as I've described elsewhere, an unrelenting, painstaking process of dismantling what once was thought to be organic, natural, and egosyntonic. My complaint is necessary because if we are to counter psychoanalytic innocence, we must commit to this dismantling of what is, not as an empty gesture of annihilation, but rather in service of what can become. I lean here on insights not only from decolonial theorists, but from academic and abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who reminds us that, quote, abolition is not absence, it is presence. What the world will become already exists in fragments and pieces, experiments and possibilities. It is building the future from the present in all the ways we can, end quote. An abolitionist call to action, yes, but also decidedly, and perhaps not surprisingly, psychoanalytic in process and concept, one that, however, seems to rarely be used as an effective starting point for autocritique in our field. I've learned and extrapolated from Robin D.G. Kelly's work that this abolitionist stance should push us to go beyond our reliance on empathy and instead work towards charting what might be needed to forge an ethics of solidarity in an anti-oppressive clinical praxis, especially within psychoanalysis. This framework, as I imagine it, has at its core a militant disruption of the violence done by seemingly innocent psychoanalytic praxis and theory, heeding the call to practice what Glenn Coulthard in Red Skin, White Masks has termed a politicized anger and a disciplined maintenance of resentment, end quote. Not as a deflection from the depth work of psychoanalysis, but rather as a contingency for vibrant livability in the face of oppressive structures, as Nadira Shalhoub Kavrukian reminds us. In this way, my approach, in keeping with Robin Kelly's own theorizing around the importance of solidarity, works against, quote, a singular story, someone's singular experience, and then from that projecting out, a stance that he highlights gets us into the problem of innocence, end quote. The insistence on presence is especially important. In her book, White Innocence, which examines the aggression and claims to innocence of Dutch colonialism in its current instantiations, Gloria Wecker invokes Edward Said's cultural archive and reminds us that innocence is maintained by consciously constructing what are intended to be claimed and then indeed are carefully used as organic categories of dominance. These categories rely on the non-presence of the other, even as white colonial dominance is sustained through hyper-attention to the other. In order to make sense of this dissonance, a sustained practice of innocence is necessary, what comes to be deployed as an unconscious egress for guilt, because in fact, there has been a maintenance of varied forms of exploitation and dominance, paramount of which is racial aggression. For Wecker, as for Fanon, quote, it's the racist that creates the inferiorized, and in so doing also constructs what Fanon terms a racial allocation of guilt, whereby the colonized, the racial other, is always presumed guilty. In this configuration, presence is very much needed, as much to sustain the colonizer as to, for our purpose today, disrupt their violent logics that masquerade as innocence. Speaking to the process of normalizing domination, Wecker posits a psychoanalytic interpretation that is useful to our talk today, and here I'm quoting her. What cannot be admitted, what is in other words repressed but always feared, is the permeability of the boundaries, the fact that dominant groups are never securely in place and have to be made and remade until the difference between the self and the subordinate other appears natural and thus fixed, end quote. My lodging complaint then also speaks to the urgency I feel to name this process of violent making and remaking sustained through psychoanalytic innocence. In so doing, I want to simultaneously stay us against the counter impulse to manic repair, a move that serves as another outpost of innocence. Indeed, as Margarita Palacios and Stephen Sheeha note, quote, innocence operates within epistemological and ontological framework where desire of the self-same is the binding glue to coloniality of power that structures aestheticized engagements with the matrix of race, gender, sexuality, and capitalism. Here, the desire for humanity's repair, that is white repair, emerges from the crease where the other inhabits and exists alone, then as an object of violence, and then repair or absolution, end quote. My complaint works to naturalize also a politics of refusal against processes of normalization, which would insist on a particular type of repair, one that serves to stabilize hegemonic categories while obscuring the price at which this comes. The intellectual place from which this talk flows is fundamentally one that binds my work over the past decade, the heart of which is the exploration of an anti-oppressive psychoanalytic praxis, a praxis that attends to ideology, that attends to psychic and material reality, and one that involves itself in resisting the myth of safety and instead sustaining attention to the site of the clinic, our training programs, our institutes, and our entire field as places where violence is enacted, not innocently, but by design. In this way, perhaps I'm not offering anything formally new today. Rather, in reclaiming disavowed truths, I'm summoning something quite old, what has long been available in material reality, a reality that has generously been reflected back to us, and not just in recent years, by theorists and clinicians from the global South, and by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, scholars and patients alike in this settler colony. As psychoanalytic practitioners, scholars, and academics, a sustained connection to this material reality becomes especially central, not only because the intrapsychic is seductive, but precisely because in our common parlance, the over-reliance on the intrapsychic becomes conveniently dangerous only for those who, for example, practice ego psychology. This neat receptacle comes to contain our material reality connectivity problem, so to speak, rather than recognize how splitting off material reality actually marks an ideological prerequisite to psychoanalytic innocence. This realization is even more integral when we consider, as Wecker highlights, and here I'm quoting from her, that, quote, the cultural archive is located in many things, in the way we think, do things, and look at the world, in what we find sexually attractive, in how our affective and rational economies are organized and intertwined. Most important, it's between our ears and in our hearts and souls. And I think that's the most important part. It's between our ears and in our hearts and souls, end quote. Said in this way, ideology is intrinsic to the viability of psychoanalytic innocence and emerges as squarely ours, that is our fields, to reckon with. Here we should be particularly attentive to the ways in which, for example, material realities have been relegated to mere ghosts or hauntings in our theory and practice. I disagree with this reading and offer that it is actually ideological misattunement, a central mechanical tenet of psychoanalytic innocence that allows for displacement of material reality, of embodiment, of, for example, Fanon's corporal or epidermal schema, his fixedness as a Black man, into the past, into a ghost. While not new in its essence then, what I'm insisting on is a refusal to activate and rely on the mark of invisibility, to refuse to actively invisibilize, to crib Fred Moten. That is, to focus on presence, not absence. In doing so, I'm attempting to bring into focus and name publicly, in an act of responsibility and accountability, that which insists on being invisible and that which is free to act without culpability is actually hypervisible if we animate the ideology of psychoanalytic innocence. It is psychoanalytic innocence that aims to forcibly spectralize the lived and embodied material reality of the present, and instead conscript us to treat as though organic and then to retain fidelity to a particular type of theory and practice, where the clinical encounter and its resultant enactments, for example, are merely the function of a foreclosed history. As Ahmad's Lodge, rather than situate myself in the haunted world with its valves of innocence, I'm therefore instead dwelling in what Palestinian poet Hala Alian's stunning poem, The Honest Wife, notes as, quote, a place so old it only knew how to tell the truth, end quote. This place not only builds the future from the present, as Wilson Gilmore tells us, but also foregrounds a most profound call from D.G. Kelly to remain engaged in a three-pronged analysis of historical materialism, class struggle, and dialectical processes to quote what he says, reveal what is hidden from public view. And nothing's more psychoanalytic than that. For me, this place also actively engages and incorporates Shireen Razak and Mary Louise Fellowes' Race to Innocence, Tuck and Yang's Settler Moves to Innocence, and Gloria Wecker's White Innocence in the context of psychoanalysis. In doing so, it aims to recenter what is displaced while actively decentering what insists on the displacement. Because simply put, as Razak and Fellowes remind us, and open quote, when we view ourselves as innocent, we cannot confront the hierarchies that operate among us, end quote. Our inconsistency as a field and oftentimes outward disavowal and a refusal to confront the hierarchies is operative in the seamlessness of psychoanalytic innocence. Let me pause here to outline what I plan to do with the remainder of my time, having now discussed the texture and importance of interrogating psychoanalytic innocence at this particular socio-political juncture. What I will do next is discuss how and from where the concept of psychoanalytic innocence emerged, and then offer a field-specific example to further illustrate its mechanics. A small word on the affective impact of dwelling in a place so old it only knew how to tell the truth. It's disruptive. In that disruption, and in keeping with a Fanonian commitment to interrogate our own person in service of sociotherapy, I invite you to reflect alongside me on how psychoanalytic innocence also mobilizes internally against disequilibrium. Because our work takes up the affective, I'm especially attentive to, for example, how we may innocently excavate our own pain in order to deflect from the disruption that's unfolding. A move that for Tuck and Yang is central to maintaining innocence. Here they remind us, quote, because pain is the token for oppression, claims to pain then equate to claims of being an innocent non-oppressor, end quote. I'm hopeful we can practice here the ways that we can grapple with our field's reliance on innocence to truly reckon with the hierarchies that operate among us and do so without the need to activate our collectively normalized escape latches. The concept of psychoanalytic innocence emerges from the forthcoming book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, that my partner Stephen Sheeha and myself have written, and it's set to be released November 8th, so I'm very excited about that. While I extrapolate here to events that the concept is ubiquitous in our field, in the book, we used it to discuss the ways psychoanalytic theory and practice can work in service of violence in the context of the settler colonial condition in Palestine. For example, we tend to how ideologically psychoanalysis insistence on dialogue, reason, and working through without a sustained analysis of the material conditions of dispossession in Palestine acts under the pretense not only of neutrality and objectivity, but also universalism, empathy as an endpoint of process, and the myth of safety. We name how in this context, psychoanalytic innocence works in concert with the logics of settler colonialism and occupation, denying the everyday violence enacted on Palestinians, and conveniently forgetting how this is also structured by the unconscious. Indeed, here we map how psychoanalytic innocence relies on the hegemony of what Lynn Layton has termed normative unconscious processes. Deployed in this way, psychoanalytic innocence is particularly insidious because it simultaneously forfeits psychoanalysis' supposition of unconscious process and structure while also ignoring material reality. I want to also note that in discussing psychoanalytic innocence, we depart from Christopher Bolas's understanding of violent innocence, which he locates within the patient rather than enacting harm on the side of the therapist. Even as he indicates that violence innocence is often one of the more perverse dynamics and states that the violent innocent provokes the other to a uselessly disturbed frame of mind, he does so with the understanding that violent innocent lives within the psychic space of the patient. Psychoanalytic innocence, conversely, is not understood as an intrapsychic process that disrupts the analyst's thinking, but rather as an innocence that pervades the ideological position of the practice, the theory, and therefore the relational space of psychoanalysis. In this way, one might understand that the analyst is the one that comes to enact violent innocence, if only because they have, quote, what Hagarty calls the psychological power, which is understood in terms of who has power to name the psychology of another, end quote. This translates to what Stephen Portuguese warns us about the misuse of psychoanalysis' hallmark principle, neutrality, what he says has turned out to be a technical intervention that obfuscates the recognition and elucidation of the role of ideologically constructed factors in the psychoanalytic theory of treatment, end quote. To bring it back to our talk today, if, following Fanon and others, we understand psychoanalysis as being primarily a method and practice of reading, organizing, and translating the unconscious individually as well as collectively and socially, then the mechanics of psychoanalytic innocence work to at once obfuscate this process and insist on the fact that the obfuscation is not happening. Therefore, it maintains innocence. This process is not individual or individualized, but rather is structural and is a constitutive piece of theory and practice deployed to preserve psychoanalytic practice as is. According to Razak and fellows, this is done through a process of marking, perhaps what we can understand as identification and disidentification. They note, quote, the marking of subordinate groups and the unmarking of dominant groups leaves the actual process of domination obscured and thus intact. Subordinate groups simply are the way they are. Their condition. Oh, I think there's Fatima, I think your sound's on. There we go. Okay, thank you. I'm going to go back to the quote. The marking of subordinate groups and the unmarking of dominant groups leaves the actual processes of domination obscured, thus intact. Subordinate groups simply are the way they are. Their condition is naturalized. To be unmarked or unnamed is also simply to embody the norm and not to have actively produced and sustained it. To be the norm, yet to have the norm unnamed, is to be innocent of the domination of others, end quote. Here I would also like to draw our attention to how liberal and humanistic psychoanalysis maintains this naturalization, remaining complicit through forms of oppression by seeking to graft and universalize healthy adaptability onto colonial and racialized subjects whose humanity and psychic interiority are negated. In a liberalized version of psychoanalytic theory, these colonial subjects are only able to access empathy when they occupy the position of victim and therefore surrender their rights to experience political and material realities in full alignment with their experience and social context. A psychological process that involves succumbing to colonial interjects, as I've noted elsewhere, or to what David Eng calls colonial object relations. This is why even when psychoanalysis attempts movement, for example, we hear that we recognize that race, gender, and class and ableism need to have space in our clinic and theories, psychoanalytic innocence insists on a particular form of relationship with one's subjectivity in these realms, as they're often called. It does so by, for example, nodding to the importance of race and the ways racism structures discourse and relationality, but also paradoxically weaponizes notions of higher functioning, analyzability, and the golden standards of politesse and dialogue when casually enacting racism, as so often happens. In doing so, it demands an unspoken, yet affectively felt prerequisite for racialized, gendered, and class subjectivity. You must simultaneously open yourself to predominantly white, ableist, and cis heteronormative spaces, but do so without claim to historical and political specificity. And also commit to a fundamentally self-effacing dialogue while being aggressed upon in these spaces. This dialogue is expected to happen without noting the visceral truth, what Fanon might say is felt on a muscular or cellular level, of how this feels and what it means materially. That is the reality of what Dorothy Holmes might call wrecking effects. We are not to speak of how this neutralized and depoliticized dialogue, whether in the clinic or professionally, replicates a particular social order that demands one's non-affect while itself being mobilized through affect, demanding to be felt, but remain unseen, unacknowledged, and unpacked, and therefore innocent. Politesse, containment, maintaining the depressive position, holding on to the psychoanalytic stance, capital T, capital P, using higher order defenses, and all the other ways this expectation is communicated, has the subtle yet insidious role of a mission civilisatrice that works to defang the affective charge that would out psychoanalytic innocence's intended purpose. Indeed, the affective charge needs defanging precisely because it would disclose, in Fanon's words, who the confusion mongers truly are. Razak and fellows remind us about this central feature of innocence, stating, quote, how groups on the margins are positioned in relation to one another on the disrespectable, or more aptly the degenerate side of the divide, is of central importance to understanding how the dominant group produces and sustains feelings of innocence for itself and groups on the margin, end quote. More pointedly stated, in these ways, psychoanalytic innocence normalizes a particular discourse of analysis that works in service of white supremacy. Psychoanalytic innocence also mechanizes a continued split against which it purports to work, not just between good and bad objects, but with specific focus of affective energy toward and against those who attempt to disrupt normative processes. All of these positions become possible when we understand psychoanalytic innocence as a practice of structural ideological misattunement that involves affirming racist and settler colonial realities and logics, while also pathologizing the will and desire for liberation and self-actualization of oppressed peoples collectively and individually. I will shift now to an example of psychoanalytic innocence, one that allows us to circle back to my insistence on autocritique as a primary mode of, quote, building the future from the present in all the ways we can, end quote. I debated whether to use clinical examples, since we know this phenomenon does live within the clinic. However, since white liberal moves to innocence, especially in this settler colony, also include individual confessionals or apologies that acknowledge harm done without true repair, I've decided to implicate us as an entire field. I provide this specific example of harm done on a field level because this instance, which unfolded over a span of a year, was the linchpin in my thinking about and being attentive to the something else that I, in a very Fanonian sense, felt was happening, but did not yet have the words for. As I've noted, this something else is often felt on a visceral level, one that I have found psychoanalytic innocence works to muddle and erase in service of ideological equilibrium. I also hope that in providing this example, I am militantly showing how this concept does not just live within the clinic, nor it is only enacted on the individual level through the analytic dyad, but rather is structural, systemic, is quite old, and also through its insistence on apolitical, universal humanism has global reach. I'm hopeful that this will alert us to our field's responsibility in the suffering of others, as Leighton reminds us. Perhaps there's no greater example of the ways psychoanalytic innocence is deployed than with the mere mention of Palestine. Elsewhere, I've referred to Palestine as a four-letter word in psychoanalytic circles, often instigating a cataclysmic collapse of analyzable space. Here, rather than focus on the mechanics of psychoanalytic innocence in Palestine proper, I would like to use the example of the decision by the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy to hold their annual conference in Tel Aviv in June 2019 to provide an analysis of the mechanics of psychoanalytic innocence. Many of you might be familiar with some of the details and the years of negotiations in the aftermath of this decision. So I'll primarily focus on how psychoanalytic innocence operates rather than deflect from the affective charge by exclusivizing or essentializing this to IARP as an institution as though it only lives there. Indeed, IARP's bad faith decision is helpful only in as much as it provides us with a very visible and archetypal example of how liberal modalities of psychoanalytic innocence and practice betray what Avi Sekatopoulou also aptly refers to as whiteness closing ranks within psychoanalysis, and here when the issue of Palestine is raised. Psychoanalytic innocence emerges as a powerful lens to read why the IARP deliberately crossed an international picket line called for by more than 20,000 Palestinian social workers and psychologists. This analytic is especially important if we're to move away from sanctimonious ad hominem attacks. The IARP affair demonstrates psychoanalytic innocence, bringing into focus the mechanisms by which psychoanalytic associations and indeed practitioners, especially from the global north, not only disavow the comprehensive violence of settler colonial systems, but also actively perpetuate and participate in this violence by pathologizing, in this instance, resistance to Israeli apartheid, and by diminishing the value of Palestinian life and well-being. Indeed, psychoanalytic innocence helps us account for the glaring contradictions in IARP's positions, seemingly indecipherable to IARP leadership. For example, without invoking psychoanalytic innocence, how else do we account for locating the conference in Tel Aviv with the theme, quote, imagining with eyes wide open relational journeys, end quote. This decision betrays the unconscious marking, as noted by Razak and fellows, immediately naming whose relational journey is worth imagining. As I've noted elsewhere, how does an organization imagine a conference in the settler colonial state of Israel without implicitly, if not explicitly, disimagining Palestinians, or at least a particular type of Palestinian? This was further highlighted in an absurd pre-conference roundtable discussion that aimed to speak about, quote, the absence of Palestinians to look at the obstacles to an Israeli-Palestinian encounter, end quote. Even here, they blatantly disavow the countless Israeli-Palestinian encounters that happen under a brutal occupation, especially at checkpoints and so forth. The same roundtable asks the seemingly innocent questions, quote, can we create a dialogue about the absence of dialogue? Can we give presence in the absence of presence? Is the absence a powerful protest or a refusal to see another, end quote. I can't make this up. We are able to see clearly through this example how the power of psychoanalytic innocence relies heavily on the ability to weaponize and abuse theory to gaslight those who engage in the politics of refusal, whether that be a patient, a supervisee, a student, an analysand, or in this case, Palestinians and those who believe in their right to self-determination. The IARP replicated the same strategies of innocence within psychoanalysis, with the organization and its leadership appealing to abstract notions of reason, civility, and of course, dialogue, all the while disavowing how these terms and notions are decidedly not neutral, and in fact rely on racialized, classed, and gendered codes to gain traction. And here we might recall Wecker's use of Said's cultural archive. Psychoanalytic innocence, resembling Palacios and Shihai's white innocence, and here I quote from them, within its habitus of universal humanity, permits us to consider how the flesh itself, that is constituent of the we, is not ideologically and socially same throughout this heterogeneity of the third person collective, end quote. In this way, IR provided the ideological valence of impartiality and openness as the operative structural process of collusion with racism and settler colonialism. What is especially important for us today when considering psychoanalytic innocence are the ways in which the field, IARP and beyond, brazenly deploys tropes of dialogue and neutrality to censure, while simultaneously deflecting from how these very concepts are also mechanisms for collusion, control, and dominance. This perhaps was evident in IARP's co-presidential statement. Quote, I'm quoting here from them. We will be extending invitations to Palestinian colleagues, and we will work to enable their presence with us. Rather than foreclosing those issues and silencing conversation, we aim to create within our relational psychoanalytic conference an open and safe space in which attendees across the political spectrum can engage and exchange views. We believe that dialogue, more than ever, is needed across divides, end quote. While on the surface, this might strike some as reasonable, if we operationalize what we've learned about psychoanalytic innocence, about the ways the cultural archive maneuvers unconsciously, and most importantly, attend to sustained material analysis, the statement emerges as an archetypal hybrid of liberal bad faith, combining the white innocence of the United States with the disavowal and nomenclature of soft Zionism. Even if Palestinian and non-Palestinian Arab clinicians had been willing to betray the Palestinian call for boycott, most were not able to travel to Israel legally, as they would have faced criminal proceedings in their home countries. Finally, we know that even if Palestinian clinicians were able to receive visas in their own country, the process is intended to be psychologically humiliating and subjecting Palestinians to such processes just to be present would be an unconscionable violation. The weaponization of language contrived to shut down, not create, space and legitimized explicitly non-Palestinian voices as the arbiters and protectors of Palestinian freedom of speech. Samah Jabr, a Palestinian psychiatrist and chair of the mental health unit at the Palestinian Ministry of Health, hones in on such language, saying, and here I'm quoting from her, leadership took ownership of the virtuous language of dialogue, the third, and empathy, while asserting that Palestinians who declined their kind invitation might be indulging in the reprehensible language of splitting, non-inclusiveness, or acting out, end quote. In this particular example, the statement acts as a testimony to the predetermined parameters of conversation or dialogue, one that communicates little interest in material reality. In this way, psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic organizations quickly come to embody what Fanon warned us were the ways in which clinicians act as agents of the state. If one thinks about IARP's choices of tactics as demonstrating a hybrid of classic modalities of white innocence and settler colonialism, consequent events underscore how aggression and violence also resultingly materialize when white innocence is confronted by the willful subject who refuses dehumanization. And this, of course, is what Wecker illustrates for us. Namely, IARP not only egregiously attempted to derail an independent event called Voices of Palestine, held simultaneously to their New York 2018 conference, but also in what we already know is a surveillance state in the context of the United States, hotel security was alerted of a potential danger posed by supporters of the event. Indeed, the New York Police Department and Homeland Security were present in full and visible force during the Voices event, a presence that was deemed coincidental by IARP leadership, despite proof from hotel staff stating otherwise. Here, innocence is marked, since surely, especially as psychoanalysts, one could anticipate that a call to the New York Police Department about concerns regarding any activity in support of Palestine would be heard and read against anti-Arab and Islamophobic tropes that readily saturate the collective unconscious. If we're not using psychoanalytic innocence as a framework, we might be tempted, indeed seduced, into reading IARP's response to the dissent of its members as a psychological enactment of the irreparable violence between Zionists and Palestinians. What this reading misses, however, are the ways in which this response demonstrates a clear example of how psychoanalytic innocence ensures that psychoanalysis as a field, ideologically and politically, colludes with power, not as a byproduct or symptom, but as constitutive of its practice and theory. This is because collusion and complicity operate within a shared structural, systemic, and political tradition of whiteness that emerges out of coloniality and settler colonialism. What the traditional psychoanalytic reading also displaces is how calls for dialogue and neutrality, mainstays of our practice, are weaponized, here insinuating that there might even be a safe place where dialogue can exist. In fact, this example demonstrates how dialogue itself can be a structural tool to disempower, especially in the context of Palestine. Again, perhaps if we were not attentive to the mechanics of psychoanalytic innocence, we'd get mired in theories of displaced fear, misdirected hate, identification with the aggressor, so on and so forth. All important theoretical readings, but readings that nonetheless do not account for material reality, let alone offer a sustained analysis of struggle in the context of settler colonialism. And these readings surely do not move us any closer to building an ethics of solidarity within psychoanalysis. In our attention to psychoanalytic innocence, we can instead read a very real, raw, and unmistakable confession of how structurally psychoanalysis does not expect to be affectively and internally disturbed or disrupted. This is precisely how psychoanalytic innocence works. We as a field can still claim non-power even as we enact violence through use of our theories and in our practice. If we are to counter psychoanalytic innocence, to build an ethics of solidarity, we must be clear on this. Otherwise, betray what structurally we've always relied on, the fantasy that we can exist outside of the material reality of power. Here, psychoanalytic power is literal in terms of credibility as bestowed by the psychoanalytic establishment and the power we have to name another's process. It's also innocent, as an organization like IARP is given space to exist both as a perpetrator of political and social violence and still be received as non-threatening, afforded plausible deniability through the willful unlinking of whiteness and its violence from coloniality and from their organizational actions. And in fact, we had many pleadings with us to remember the good people within its ranks. And while of course they exist, the innocence comes in because they magically are able to undo themselves of their power to represent structures that enact violence. I've offered this as my example to flesh out how psychoanalytic innocence enacts itself in full force and in full view, because psychoanalysis continuously finds itself at this juncture, a juncture that contains many neural pathways of innocence that have been expertly honed. I've also offered this as a way to publicly entrust us with the work that a liberatory and anti-impressive psychoanalysis can commit us to, a work that does not flee or collapse in a manic defense against annihilation when refracted against the presence and material reality as embodied in the non-white or the other, a work that builds even as we dismantle. To allow for the capaciousness of this building, to allow even for this possibility, we must acknowledge that psychoanalytic innocence is not a byproduct, but rather constitutive of psychoanalytic practice and theory. We must also recognize that psychoanalytic innocence has been deployed to normalize and maintain a particular structure or order that shores up available sociopolitical fault lines. And finally, we must collectively commit to a persistent and depth-oriented disruption of the common sense ideological underpinnings that shore up psychoanalytic innocence. Thank you.
Wow, that's all I'll say, Lara. That was profound. It was bold and extremely powerful. And thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our conversation as we go forward in this evening. You know, as you were talking, and I was reflecting on the paper. There were a number of points, of course, that came up for me, and I'm going to speak a little bit about that for the next couple of minutes, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience. I'm starting to see questions coming into the chat boxes and to the Q&A box. So I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is really, you know, questions of absence and presence and innocence, objectivity, neutrality, and so on. It does seem to me that psychoanalysis and its focus on neutrality, I think from your paper, I think the point is that this, in fact, is deeply ideological. And I suppose that for me, it reminded me of some of the work of Derrida on absence and presence. And of course, Derrida makes the point that even when we believe that something is absent, that indeed its representational absence signals its very presence. And this is something quite powerful. This is perhaps helpful in making sense why, despite intuitively experiencing absences in these moments, so for example, experiencing what seems to be neutrality, there is indeed a presence as well. And of course, that presence is an ideological presence. And if one reveals that, one actually completes the story arc that seems to be missing there. So Derrida, of course, does offer us an implicit injunction to look at the ways in which to look at that which is present in indirect or discrete or backgrounded ways to perhaps see that which is seemingly absent. The prevalence of innocence and the apparent silences, of course, these operate as interlocking dimensions that reproduce our contemporary social and psychological malaise in many respects. And ideologies become integrated into psychic apparatuses. They give rise to docile citizens, to bystanders, and so on. And of course, we see this level of docility in so many parts of the world today, when new forms of authoritarianism have emerged, for example. So that was the first thing that came to mind about presence and absence and this relational stance between the two. The second, which of course is related, is that discourses are ideologically reproductive, and they serve as an intrinsic defense within the psychoanalytic canon in many respects. And so relatedly, psychoanalysis tends to rely on its own internal discourse to often nullify critique at an ideological level, creating a seeming imperviousness to injunctions for change within the field. On the matter of affect, as you were talking, I was thinking about how popular interpretations can be completely revisited with much greater originality if we not only minimize the excavation of our own affects, but also see affect as being deeply connected to the social world and the experiences of people within that world. So, for example, and you know, I raised this in a recent talk as well. What does it mean when race, for example, is overlaid on top of desire or hatred or attachment or love or aggression? And how does this shift the very way that we may have made interpretations about affective states and so forth? The third point, I suppose, that came to mind was this question of repair and the preoccupation with repair. What I've sometimes, referred to as the idea of irresolvability. And, you know, as I've mentioned, there are indeed limits to the processes of knowing, to the process of recognition, to the processes of comprehensibility and resolution. But these limits can themselves offer opportunities for continued accompaniment and generativity, with ongoing possibilities for psychic reorganization, recalibration, and change. I mean, psychoanalysis, as we all know, is a messy business. And the liberal humanist tradition that you, of course, speak of is one that tends to seek closure, one that tends to seek repair, one that tends to seek resolution. But of course, this does not mirror the material realities of the world and our experiences within him. So the point here for me that I took away was that actually resolution is sometimes neither possible, nor is it in fact desirable, if one is thinking about social change in many respects. The fourth point was, of course, knowledge moves, it travels, it's not static, it's shifting all the time. And again, knowledge is very much the product of context and authors. And as Edward Said has made the point, knowledge that seems to be a product of an earlier figure of thought can find new interpretations and travel in new contexts in novel ways when it comes into contact with later cultural, political, and epistemological formations. The fact of the matter is that psychoanalysis, despite a fairly lengthy history, has been slow to embrace this and has perhaps been less introspective about the ideological content of the field, beyond the perfunctory nod or paying homage to matters of exclusion, othering, and social cleavages that continue to find resonances in our society. The penultimate point is really this question about, I suppose, you haven't used the term, but I think, is this idea of ontology. And on the concept of ontology, I think my reading of what you're saying is that you are suggesting that, of course, this is not a spectral or ghostly figment that we encounter when we witness hierarchies of power being enacted, but are a set of continuities in the unevenness of the world that continue to operate. And that they are not symbolic, but they are in fact material realities and encounters in the world today. And that one can't think about this as a ontology, but one has to think about this as a material reality in many respects. And the final point, when I think about what it is that you putting forward, is that it seems to me that the very nature, the canonical nature of psychoanalytic theorizing must consider more fully the reciprocal and intricately interwoven relationships between the exterior social world and the internal psychological world, but not only in terms of relationality, because of course we do that fairly well already in certain branches of psychoanalytic thinking, but it is to move beyond relationality and also to think about this in terms of the operations of ideology itself as being intrinsically embedded within psychoanalytic thought, within the paradigm itself. So I thought I'd just give you something to chew on, as we think a little bit about a conversation. And I don't know if you want to come back immediately, on any of these things, Laura, before we open it up.
Sure. I mean, having been in conversation with you, Garth, there's more than just something to chew on. I'm so appreciative of your your skill and your ability to engage in these things in such a wonderful way. To the point of Derrida, the Gloria Wecker's work, Psychoanalytic Innocence, Psychoanalytic White Innocence, that book is phenomenal. And in one of the chapters, she uses a Derrida quote about the universal humanism of psychoanalysis, in which he says that psychoanalysis, because of its universal humanism, is, quote, blind to most of the earth, right? And I think we're not far from that anymore. I mean, we're sort of talking about a different time, but we're talking about time right now. And I think that that is something really important. And this is what I mean about haunting and talking about things as ghosts of the past. And that's, I think, something that really gets under my skin in a very specific way, because I can only read that as an active displacement that hides very well in the symbolic and in our theory. Our theory has the words for ghosts and hauntings and its repression, it's of the past. But when we're talking about material conditions, when we're talking about historical specificity, I can only read that as a defensive displacement, right? So that things come to just be of the past. Well, Indigenous scholars always tell us that, for example, Indigenous folks are always relegated to the past as though it's not a continuous condition. Just like in Palestine, it's sort of like, oh, it's of the past rather than happening right now, right? Overlaid with what you're saying, with particular settler colonial conditions. So I think that that's, for example, in the context of the United States, I often hear people theorize or talk about the ghosts of slavery in our clinic room. And anybody who knows anything about the current context of the United States would be aghast at thinking these are ghosts. We know precisely the current day effects of a continued process of violence against Black people in the context of the United States and Indigenous people in the context of the United States, let alone other people of color who come then to exist in relationality to that particular structure. So I really think we're doing not only a great disservice, but it's an act of violence to refer to people's embodied reality as ghosts. It is right in front of, there is nothing ghostly about racism in the context of the United States. There's nothing ghostly about the continued inequities that we see that are replicated with exploitation of labor, particularly in the context of this pandemic, right? That we saw in full force. There's nothing ghostly about that. It's very real. And of course, right now, in the harrowing photos we're seeing of Haitian asylum seekers with border control whipping Haitian asylum seekers, there's nothing ghostly about that. This is material reality. And that's what I mean about material reality. To your point about repair, not only is it decolonial and it's anti-decolonial, right? To sort of go for a resolution that is foreclosed. When we're talking about repair in a particular way, it's not an innocent repair. It's by and large constructed by a liberal term of what will return us to the status quo. That's why repair, as you say it, is not, that doesn't need to happen, because we're betraying what type of repair we're looking for, right? So repair does not come to mean reparations, for example. It does not come to mean land back. It's a particular type of repair that fits within a liberal humanist discourse that is comfortable. And that's why I think repair, and this is where Tuck and Yang talk about incommensurability, right? A solidarity of incommensurability, where how can we work away from these modes of equity, diversity, and inclusion that sort of plug in Black, Brown, Indigenous faces, and we look at this as that's the way we repair, rather than a structural, right, recognition of what does it mean when things are incommensurable, and what are the things we have to do, not for harmony or racial, pluralism, but to really take account for the violence done in incommensurable ways on different people, on different bodies.
That's great. That's a great response, Laura. So of course, you're taking us to a place where you've thought about this work beyond the clinic in some ways, and the exemplar that you've relied on in the talk this evening has really spoken about institutional and organizational dynamics. In some ways, you're talking about the field in its entirety. Yeah. And yes. So this is not only the canon, it's not only the discourse, it's not only the practice, but it's the institutionalization of psychoanalysis itself and yes. Those institutional organizational forms. And so of course, the question that I have to ask, given that you've spoken about this, is what does this mean for organizations or institutional forms of psychoanalysis? Where to from here? Where do we have to go to? Because in some ways, that is the critical question. What does this mean for institutionalized psychoanalysis? And related to that, of course, I have somebody in the chat saying, Laura, you rock. I wonder how we may name the amazing work you do. Is it possible to think about this work outside the borders of a discipline? Mm-hmm. And in some ways, they related questions. Where to from here, in your view?
Yes, thank you so much. So number one, and perhaps not by surprise because of what I've presented about, is our commitment to disrupt innocence at all costs, right? And this is a constant process of renegotiating, because we know what systems do best is recalibrate themselves. And so our sort of force to disrupt innocence, even as it recalibrates itself, is really important. I want to sort of draw our attention even to the song that we chose, that everything becomes an intervention, right? So the song in Arabic was saying the flag was not allowed, the Palestinian flag was not allowed. As we know, it's not allowed in Israel proper, right? And yet it was still flying high. And I want to use that as a sort of a metaphor for this, right? One of which is Speak Palestine, right? For me, that is my commitment, is to speak Palestine into these spaces. And I get that word from my comrade and beautiful sister, Nadira Kevorkian, is always about speaking truth to power, Palestine being one part of this. But if we can take Palestine as our sort of connecting dot, if we are committed to speaking into innocence, to speaking into the places that hide themselves, if we know our theory has valves into the symbolic, then we speak into reality, into material reality. So disrupting innocence. On this part, this idea of splitting, right? We hear this so much. And that's what I mean about our theory being weaponized. I mean, I'm a theory jockey, right? I love theory and I could sit there all day. And there are ways in which language and theory gets mobilized and weaponized to shut down resistance, right? Capital R resistance, not just psychoanalytic resistance, which itself can be resistance, but this idea of splitting, we hear this all the time. I hear this on listservs. I hear it mobilized against students. I hear it in our talks where people are like, well, if I take a position on this, right, this is splitting. And we need, as analysts, to hold the depressive position or be able to do both. And I think elsewhere I've said that splitting forfeits its pathology when we are talking about oppression and conditions such as settler, colonial conditions, or apartheid, right? It would be absurd for us to think that somehow that's a split if we're to stand against South African apartheid, right? I don't want to be part of that split. And I think that's the way our theory sometimes weaponizes its language. And that it allows us to innocently maintain our status as agents of the state while also saying, no, we're actually a helping profession. So it's also problematizing, what is our concept of health? Is it to regenerate neoliberal subjectivity and have people go out and work and succumb to their oppressive positions? Or do we join in the resistance to disrupting these positions over and over again? A second thing I would say is be prepared to relinquish power. That's our next thing, right? And in some ways, again, that might seem to follow on like, commit class suicide or committing professional suicide, is be prepared for that destructuring, dismantling, to really relinquish power, power to name another psyche, a power to shape discourse, our power to lend credibility to violent state operations, a power to claim innocence, really. And with that, to be truly revolutionary and decolonial in our field, right? This again of remaking, making and remaking, and doing and undoing, which is very decolonial. I want to say that what we're doing today is a part of that, right? When we have these transnational, internationalist, global solidarity networks, right? Because I know from myself, it feels isolating and it feels like you're up against a lot, which we are, right? With the rise of ethno-nationalism and fascism across the board, and settler colonial states linking together to crush our struggles. Doing this sort of thing is precisely what provides, for me, life affirmation, right? And provides the space where I don't fall prey to the gaslighting that psychoanalytic innocence might do to us. Again, to borrow from Nadira, she talks about dismemberment, that systems of oppression work to literally dismember and atomize us. And so a counter force to that is us doing this sort of thing. I want to also invoke my friends and colleagues, Feluke Taylor and Robert Downs, who have written wonderfully about training and curriculum, about how things must look like if we're really working towards this. So there's wonderful work being done. I mean, it's a harrowing time in our world, and it's also one of deep generative excitement about where we can go and what, and the borders that we can traverse, right? Or reimagine what psychoanalytic praxis and theory can look like.
So as you were talking, in our previous webinar, we had Nelson Maldonado Torres on
Yes.
on the webinar, and he'd made a similar point. Actually, he was talking about the idea that a counter-catastrophic psychological science has got to be premised on the possibility of rupture with that science, and that you in some ways may have to give up what you hold dearest at a professional level. And I think that the point that he was also making was not only that one needs to think about relinquishing power, but he was also talking about the fact that no single discipline will give you the silver bullet to slay the dragon, so to speak, you know.
That's right.
That in some ways one has to start thinking about naming the new thing that one is building. That may sit outside your discipline. It may sit fully outside your discipline. It may sit partially outside your discipline, but then one does have to contemplate that kind of relinquishing of power is a distinct possibility if one really wants to build something new. And again, I mean, I think we've all encountered this with students. As we train them, we hear students say, as we introduce new pieces of work, but that's not psychoanalysis.
Right.
That's not psychology. What you're talking about is something in sociology or political science or development studies. And it seems to me that one has to be thinking about expanding and extending the boundaries of disciplines, to even thinking about the collapsing of disciplines, if one really wants to think about how it is that one overcomes the problems like psychoanalytic innocence, for example. Yeah.
Yes. And I think this is such a great point you're bringing up, Garth, especially about students, right? Because if our students come to us already with that notion, that precisely tells us what ideological positions are at play, right? This is the sort of sides cultural archive, or what Gloria Wecker says, it's between our ears and in our souls. It already exists. So rather than it taking us by surprise every time, right, is a sort of understanding that because of the logics of settler colonialism, because of the logics of these oppressive systems that mobilize through ideology, that those positions already exist as a possibility, right? And so it becomes our imperative to disrupt them through our pedagogy, through our speaking events, through the ways that we talk about these things, and to really commit to that. And to the point that Nelson makes, who's a dear friend and colleague, I tell my students this. I teach a critical community consultation and intervention course, and some of my comrades today are on that syllabus, right? And what I say to them is, I want you all to see how, for example, critical community psychology, critical race theory, queer theory, all these disciplines use psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis does not use these theories by and large, right? There are spaces that we're forging for that, but there's something about the sort of isolation of psychoanalysis from these spaces that tells on itself. Right now, we can say there's a particular history to that, particularly in North American psychoanalysis. And I want to give a shout out to folks in the global South who refuse that, right? And that for me also is my commitment to a global solidarity struggle in our clinical spaces, that our activism and our psychoanalytic presence is not split, right? And psychoanalysis has those radical roots that have magically been disappeared, right? So Marxism, also all of our theories that help us, that have a rich history, even within psychoanalysis, but have been disappeared from the canon. And I know you were, Garth did a wonderful job on a Fanon plenary. He won't speak for himself, but I will, that we had at the American Psychoanalytic Association. And one of the things we were talking about is how oftentimes there's this conversation about Fanon having a renaissance. And I think resisting against these narratives, even the way we talk about this imperial notion of who gets to be in the canon, whose narratives are present, who's not, what is essential reading and what is not essential reading, so that we reset up this periphery, right, knowledge production, right, what's peripherally and what's central. When we speak out against this and say, actually, no, folks have been using Fanon, not just in the global South, but also here. But that brings us into the space where it's not a disconnection from the social, the activist, and psychoanalysis in the clinic, right? They're one and the same.
So Laura, you know, I could go on for hours chatting with you like this. but I'm seeing so many things coming up on the chat and so on. So I don't want to hog the floor, and I'm going to try and weave this into our conversation so that we get an opportunity to really kind of respond to some of the points that are being made. And there are a number of points here that are really speaking to what does this mean for our training? What does this mean for the training of psychologists? Because I think, there are points about how it is that psychoanalytic training in a context like South Africa, for example, is much more practical and pedagogical. It's not really thinking about a psychopolitical approach to psychological training, that actually questions like structural racism are not really touched upon in the training of psychologists, not only in South Africa, but in many other parts of the world. I think there's also a question that's been raised in the chat about the experience of psychoanalytic innocence with whiteness in particular, and I suppose what one could refer to as the ignorance contract, I didn't know. Expression that disrupts any conversation going forward. How does one think about training? And maybe you can talk a little bit about training, what your thoughts on training, and where it is that we need to be thinking about taking psychological training and perhaps even psychoanalytic training to new levels.
Sure. Let me answer first about the psychoanalytic training as pedagogical, not taking up issues of structural racism. And then I'll give an example from my own teaching, certainly not as the only way to do it, but just the ways I've been experimenting with how to disrupt these processes within an institutional framework, and working from my knowledge, from my decolonial knowledge, and sort of commitment to a radical and revolutionary psychoanalysis. So number one, sort of examples of in South Africa that psychoanalysis is taught much more pedagogically without attention to structural racism. We see the same thing in the United States, and we see the same thing as a state now known as Israel. So this is what I mean about perhaps it's not by chance that these states that have particular histories, that have done unspeakable violence on Black and brown bodies, are the ones who come to teach psychoanalysis in this sanitized way, right? And I think there's something to be said about that. That's what I mean about it's not by chance. It's not by chance that a settler colonial state like the United States, like Israel, even in a post-apartheid state like South Africa, and I say that lightly, knowing some of the structures that are still in place to continue a certain type of apartheid, even post-apartheid, that these are particularly the states in which we need to be disrupting these notions of innocence, because they gain to win the most from presenting a particular defanged, depoliticized psychoanalysis. And I think the ways in which we do that is reclaim our radical roots, right? Again, this idea of Fanon, whether it's Fanon or whether it's a Marxist tradition within psychoanalysis that goes a long way, right? We know that there were Marxist psychoanalysts that were fighting against the Nazification of psychoanalysis during the Nazi era. These are things that were available to us, and move away from the fantasy notion of what psychoanalysis is, right? Freud had free clinics. And if you're looking at Freud as like the most neutral person, we know he wasn't, but somehow these histories align, and they don't align us by accident. They're regenerated over and over and over and over again, right? And so the ways in which these things are constructed. So let me use just a tiny example of what I've been experimenting with that has yielded somewhat of a difference, I would hope, mainly because of the generosity of my students who have shared their experience with me. So I was hired to sort of restructure what in the United States is called diversity training in the curriculum, which again, in and of itself as a statement, I always tell my students, this word means nothing, because if we're talking about diverse, it's in relationship to what? We're already from its inception saying that diversity is against whiteness, right? So, but we'll, structural analysis from within. And one of the things that was really important for me is how do I balance, right, particularly in the context of the United States, with a global sort of reach, because we have international students too, how do I balance this space I think we all find ourselves in, of attending to the larger group dynamics with an understanding of how what happens in the classroom, familiar fault lines, where this goes to the point of white people, oh, I didn't know, and the lived and embodied experience of Black, Indigenous, or people of color, right? Who always hold the responsibility to organize the affect in the room. And so it's attending to both of those. But I start off with naming non-negotiable truths. We are not here to take up if white supremacy exists. It does. We are not here to take up if the patriarchy exists. It does. We're not here to take up how class exploitation exists. It does. So I think being comfortable with naming non-negotiable truths and holding the space for what that elicits from people depending on where they are in their social location. The way I've done that pedagogically is I run the group as a discussion, but as a sort of counterpart to that, or complementary, there's a journal entry in which I engage one-on-one with students extensively to respond to the places where they're still work. And for me, I found that has worked against the shame that white students collapse in, or this moves to innocence of, well, I didn't mean it, because they have a space to engage in the places they're working through without the responsibility of their cohort members to hold that, right? It's a responsibility of facilitation. Does that take a lot of affective energy on my part? Absolutely, but that is a way that we use our power and build in space for decolonial methods of thinking and working. So when they come back into the room as a group, they have a relationship with me, and I can hold those spaces of struggle, not from a sort of, I don't mean to sound like a narcissistic sort of grandiose, but just by virtue of the power as a professor, right? That is embodied in a transference, that you can hold a space for people to work through the places of whiteness, particularly, that they might not be aware of, that they feel more comfortable sharing in that space, in which I respond to every single one at length, but not overburden students who have historically been excluded and who historically have been asked to do this work. And I think that is where we go wrong too, which is where the supervisory place comes in. If we're going to training now, we need to be serious about the way that we create space for this in supervision, where we take account for historical material reality and constantly bring it into the room. We saw this a lot in Palestine, where our Palestinian colleagues are in supervision, this is in the book, are in supervision with Israeli supervisors who refuse to see what the material reality of a brutal occupation looks like, and who instead want to deflect onto behaviorism rather than sort of explore the power dynamic both in the room and in material reality, and what it means, for example, for a patient to have to cross a checkpoint to come to therapy. That's not traditional resistance, that's material reality. And the material reality is one of you as a supervisor, potentially also being you, the soldier at checkpoint.
Great. So I'm seeing a comment from Nadira in the chat as well. I'm so glad that you could be with us today, Nadira. Nadira makes the point that she says, would you consider the game of innocence and its politics as a way to sear the colonized consciousness, an active mode of mental displacement to replace?
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the mechanisms, right? It's one of the mechanisms that aim, and I think Fanon, right, spoke to us about this, about what are the ways in which the colonized aims to, I love the word you use, sear, right? Imprint on the psychic experience of the colonized, so that the colonizer is also not always necessary, right? Power is not always crude. It becomes a process of internal policing and internalized, of course, coloniality, where then we police each other or our movement or any one of these things. But you're absolutely right. It is a way in which, and because it's intangible, it's also a way to continue to claim innocence, right? I will imprint you on my mind because you, as the colonized, and particularly in the context of Palestine, know the inner workings every single day of what this looks like. And yet, if you are to speak to it, one can claim, well, what are you talking about? You know, if you have settler colonial citizenship as a Palestinian, then what are you talking about? You have access to this. You can become a psychologist. You can, all the things we see mobilized in a particular way, so that, yes, the displacement to replace, right? We see that, by the way, with language. We see that in terms of education. We see that in the eroding of historical truths as represented by maps, as represented by history, as represented by what is available with schooling. All these are, again, the ways in which the cultural archive comes to be mobilized. So how can we imagine psychoanalysis being outside of that?
That's great. You know, as you were talking about power, I was just looking again at one of the questions. And the question is really, you know, can you advise on how it is that one inserts power as a fundamental category of psychoanalysis, in the same way that we consider gender and socioeconomic status and trauma and so on, into the clinical encounter? And I suppose, I mean, just so that you're aware, Lara, I think that there are a number of people online tonight that are probably clinicians in some way, practitioners in some way. And I think that this question about the clinical encounter, how does one think about and insert power in all of its complexity and its layered forms to become part of the everyday practice inside the clinical encounter itself?
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes, wonderful question. Thank you. I suppose I'll go back to this idea of non-negotiable truths. And that is our departure point, that there's a non-negotiable truth in the hierarchies of power that exist, both within psychoanalysis, but within any practice and field of helping, because it fundamentally relies on notions of health and wellness, what productivity, of healing, and all of those are impacted by ideological positions of what those mean, right? So I suppose I would start there. Here I rely on colleagues in disability studies, and particularly Subini Ansi-Anama, who created a field called Discrit, which uses disability studies and critical race theory to draw our attention to the ways in which we discipline bodies, right? To draw our attention to the way in which she talks about in the context of the school, of how we might pathologize particular modes of being and pathologize relationships. Her work is on relationships between Black girls, and how instead of actually creating spaces for relationships of Black girls together to help them against the crush of oppression, we actually end up disciplining that and creating suspicion and separating them. So if we are to bring that into our clinic, what are the ways in which we might discipline bodies differently, even by notions of pathologization, or by bringing people closer to equilibrium when they have symptoms, right? The other way is, how do we orient them unconsciously and consciously to a particular type of subjectivity? How do we potentially tamper their will, to their revolutionary will, the moments of uprise that happen that we're taught to explore? When we use exploration as the only method by which one can come to know themselves, there's something very deeply suspiciously colonial about that, right? And it has a way of discharging that affect that can be used towards a revolutionary will to overcome power in a particular way over and over and over and over again, right? So the other thing I will say is, on this concept of power, what I tell my students, who I'm alongside them in their training, is we are not entitled to the interiority of a person just because we're a clinician. And so that position already, that understanding that somehow because someone is coming to us, we have an entitlement to their internal world, without the work of a sustained negotiation of consent about what that looks like, a sustained reworking of towards what end and a sustained analysis of our own likelihood to tamper revolutionary will, right? This is the sort of agents of the state, and we become the confusion mongers, even while we're patting ourselves on the back, like, look at me, I'm doing such great work because I'm using, right? If we know that theory and practice can be weaponized, then it's really incumbent upon us to check those, again, colonialist methods of thinking and imperialist methods of thinking about extending ourselves into the interiority of somebody else as a prerequisite of work, right? It's not our entitlement.
I mean, in some ways, you are talking about a disciplinary form of penetration and intrusion into psychic life, social life, etc. That really extends the point that you're making about how it is that kind of sovereign intrusion occurs in the material reality, that we in fact run the risk of becoming the agents of a kind of disciplinary intrusion into psychic and social life. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly. And we manage to do that without even acknowledging that we are. So if somebody sort of brings that to our attention, there's a defensiveness that colludes with a larger plane of thinking that comes from our theories. And I say this really importantly because I think many of us would think of ourselves as people who are not classical in training. And I truly believe that. And it's really curious how quickly we regress to that notion when somebody is taking up their revolutionary will, where we start to be seduced by, again, reclaiming the individual encounter as the only place of action, right? And how we might justify certain collusions with the state as a way to care for, but care is also control.
So Laura, we're kind of coming to the end of our time together this evening, and really it's been wonderful to just be able to engage you and to hear your thoughts. And it's been bold, it's been erudite, it's been elegant, it's been all of these things, and it's just superb to have you here with us. But before you go, I'm going to ask you to perhaps give us one last thought, just so that we get as much out of you as possible this evening. And in some ways, you've alluded to this already in every answer that you've provided and every conversation piece that you've articulated this evening. But I suppose that question is, if you were to say, give us a take home, just one take home, the most important take home that you think would be central to an anti-oppressive, you kind of mentioned this turn of phrase early on. You called it an anti-oppressive psychoanalytic praxis. And I suppose, what would that look like? What would that be if there was a single kind of take home that you wanted us to really be left with this evening? What do you think that would be?
Thank you so much, Garth. What a lovely question. It would be this, I think, the centrality of solidarity. Right? And if we are thinking about solidarity, and this is where Robert D.G. Kelly, I love his piece about solidarity is not a market exchange. It's not about like, you have my back, I have yours, right? It's truly a commitment to solidarity in as much, and this is what I would say to us as our field, our voice belongs in these struggles. Our voice belongs in abolitionist struggles. Our voice belongs in revolutionary struggles. Our voice belongs in the struggle for self-determination of peoples, whether it's in Palestine or South Africa or India or the context of the United States. Our voice belongs in supporting sex workers. Our voice belongs in supporting folks who align with their true gender identity. Our voice belongs in all these struggles because we understand them as interconnected networks against oppressive structures and toward revolutionary ends. What those struggles will be from moment to moment, like Fanon tells us, is a different question that must be taken up by every generation. But we belong in these struggles, and to sort of resist the atomization and resist us being siloed off into just the clinic, because the clinic, inverse it, sort of turn it inside out. It's everywhere. And I don't want us to shy away from that as though that is what dictates how good of a clinician we are or not. I'm a clinician and an activist, right? An Arab clinician and activist, a pro-Palestinian Arab clinician activist, and all those things are non-negotiable.
Well, Laura, all I can say is that the last comment, I think, sums it up in the chat here. Hard hitting. And again, I think it's been a bold and a beautiful presentation. It's been wonderful to have you with us this evening. I really just want to extend my thanks to you on behalf of the Psychological Society of South Africa. It's been absolutely superb. You know, you're going to have an opportunity to go through the chat at some point, and you're going to see all the affirmations that you've received for the superb talk this evening. Just thank you so much. We hope to see you in South Africa, or to visit you at some point in some part of the world, wherever you may be doing activist, psychoanalytic, anti-oppressive work. And we look forward to ongoing collaborations with you. It's been really, really wonderful to have you. I want to also end by thanking the Cisa office for organizing this. I think you made this point early on. There's a lot of invisible labor that goes into putting this this kind of webinar series together. I want to thank the Cisa office so much for just being able to get us to the place where we've had this kind of footprint, this kind of access over the course of the last 15 months or so. And truly, truly thankful and appreciative to people in the Cisa office. And lastly, I want to say thank you to every single attendee this evening. Laura, you'll be glad to know we had over 200 people in the webinar this evening. And even as we're closing, we still have 190 people on. I don't think they want to let you go. so just to everybody who's attended, it's been an absolute blast. It's been a thrill to have you all join us this evening. And from all of us to all of you, stay safe. Please do fill out all of the forms that you need to for your CPD. I have to do some housekeeping in closing. And also, please do look at the website. We've got a fantastic webinar coming up. Our last webinar will be occurring towards the end of the year. Please have a look out for that. Please have a look out for the annual President's Lecture and also the AGM for the organization and the various divisions of the organization. So from all of us at Cisa to all of you, have a great evening. Laura, our appreciation to you again, and we look forward to the next time.
Thank you all so much. Amandala.